This is Chapter 2, Sections 3 and 4. Section 3 will look at using observation for research. There are a number of other methods of observation besides the survey method: the testing method, the case study method, the longitudinal and cross-sectional methods, the naturalistic observation method, and the laboratory observation method. Correlation describes relationships, but it does not reveal cause and effect. In analyzing the results of observations, correlation is an important technique. Our main idea: psychologists use many different methods of observation in conducting their research. Then they use correlation to analyze and interpret their results. In addition to the survey method of observation, other methods of observation include the testing, case study, longitudinal, cross-sectional, naturalistic observation, and laboratory observation methods. Psychologists use several kinds of psychological tests, including intelligence tests, aptitude tests, and personality tests. A case study is an in-depth investigation of an individual or a small group. Psychologists use what they learn in a case study to generalize broader principles that apply to the larger population. In the longitudinal method, researchers select a group of participants and then observe those participants over a period of time, often years or even decades. Psychologists use this method to observe how people change over time. In the cross-sectional method, instead of following a set of individuals over a number of years, researchers select a sample that includes people at different ages. This allows researchers to compare the behavior of participants in different age groups. When psychologists observe children as they learn language naturally, such as while they interact with other children, they are using naturalistic observation. In naturalistic observation, psychologists try not to interfere with the individuals they are observing. When psychologists observe behavior in a laboratory rather than in the field, they are conducting laboratory observation. A laboratory is any place that provides the opportunity for observation and experimentation. The Skinner box and the maze are both examples of laboratories. How does the cross-sectional method fix the longitudinal method? And here are the descriptions, advantages, and disadvantages of the different methods. There's testing method and case study method. Feel free to pause as needed. The longitudinal method and cross-sectional method. Naturalistic observation method and laboratory observation method. One method psychologists use to analyze and interpret their observations is correlation. Correlation is a measure of how closely one thing is related to another. The stronger the correlation between the two things, the more closely the two things are related. Positive correlation occurs when an increase in one thing is accompanied by an increase in the other. Negative correlation occurs when a decrease in one thing is accompanied by a decrease in the other. Correlation describes relationships, but it does not reveal cause and effect. Just because two things are related does not necessarily mean that one causes the other. What are some of the limits of correlation? Environmental psychology is a relatively new field that focuses on the interaction between people and their surroundings. It draws on anthropology, geography, urban design, and architecture. Researchers in this field observe people in real-life settings. By using this method, they can make recommendations about shaping the environment. The environmental psychology movement can be traced to the work of Roger Barker, who developed the idea of behavior setting. The Graduate Center of the CUNY represents more recent developments in environmental psychology. Environmental psychology has had a big impact on commercial venues where people spend money, such as stores, malls, stadiums, casinos, and airports. Most of the research done in environmental psychology takes place in the field rather than in the lab. Section 4 at a glance. This is experimental and ethical issues. Researchers use experiments to answer questions about cause and effect. When conducting experiments, researchers must consider such things as independent and dependent variables, control groups, and the placebo effect. Psychologists follow ethical practices and standards when working with people or animals. The experimental method is used by researchers to answer questions about cause and effect. In addition, psychologists must consider the ethical issues involved in their experiments. Psychologists use the experimental method to answer questions about cause and effect. Experiments have variables, which are factors that can vary or change. The independent variable is the factor that researchers manipulate. The dependent variable is the factor whose value depends on a change made to the independent variable. Members of an experimental group receive the treatment, and members of the control group do not. All other conditions are held constant for both the experimental group and the control group. A controlled experiment uses both a control group and an experiment group. A placebo is a substance or treatment that has no effect apart from a person's belief in its effect. Feeling better simply because we expect to feel better and for no other reason is an example of the placebo effect. In an experiment, what are variables? A single-blind study keeps participants unaware of the treatment they are receiving. Participants do not know if they are in the experimental group or the control group. This is one way that researchers can avoid the influence of expectations. A double-blind study is one in which both participants and the researchers are unaware of who receives the treatment. Double-blind studies help researchers avoid the influence of expectations and remain unbiased. In both single-blind and double-blind experiments, researchers must guard against bias in favor of certain points of view by keeping participants unaware of their treatment. What's the difference between a single-blind and double-blind study? A common technique used to generalize data is to measure the central tendency. The central tendency is a number that describes the average score of a distribution. Finding the mean, median, and mode are ways of arriving at the central tendency. The mean is the average score of a distribution, the median is the middle score, and the mode is the most frequent score. Researchers use range and standard deviation to document the variability of a score. Range is the difference between the lowest score and the highest, and standard deviation is a measure of distance of every score to the mean. What is the relationship between standard deviation and the mean? Ethics are standards for proper and responsible behavior. The American Psychological Association, or the APA, has established specific ethical guidelines that psychologists are required to follow. Ethical standards limit the type of research psychologists may conduct with people. A leading ethical principle is that study participants must not be harmed. Psychologists treat the records of research participants and clients as confidential. Only in certain cases may psychologists disregard confidentiality. The APA generally requires that people who volunteer to participate in research studies provide informed consent. Informed consent means that people agree or consent to participate in a research study only after they receive a general overview of the study and have been given the choice of whether or not to participate. Some psychological experiments, however, cannot be run without deceiving people. New drug experiments or other blind studies cannot be conducted without keeping participants unaware of the treatment or of the nature of the study. Psychologists follow APA guidelines when they must use deception. Psychologists follow strict ethical rules in how they produce, store, and present their data. They need to be objective as possible when conducting a study in order to avoid bias. They must be willing to discuss their hypotheses in light of contradictory evidence collected in the research. Doing otherwise would be misleading and thus unethical. Why is confidentiality so important in psychology? The American Psychological Association has a detailed statement of principles and code of conduct. The principles are divided into 10 major categories. Listed below are 8 ways to resolve ethical issues from the first category on ethical standards. For the complete ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct, see the reference section at the back of your book. Most psychological studies that use animals do not harm the animals. Some psychologists and other scientists conduct research that may be harmful to animals. Such studies often use animals because they cannot be carried out with people for ethical reasons. Psychologists use animals only when there is no alternative and when they believe the benefit outweighs the harm, and only a small number of psychological studies involve animals. Many people, however, believe that it is no more ethical to harm animals than it is to harm people. The APA has rules of ethics for how animals used in research should be treated. Why are rules needed for the treatment of animals in experiments? And we can skip this because we are not going to do the experiment. And that is it for Chapter 2, Psychological Methods.